So I see a lot of producers struggle to make their chords a bit more interesting, or really struggle to make them at all. At the same time, I keep browsing music channels and people are going through the same old boring motions explaining how major makes you happy and minor makes you butthurt. Tell that to the blues scale. In my experience, when it comes to making good voicings, it's less about copying every single standardized chord out there and applying it verbatim, even though that should be part of your learning curve, but it's more about intervals and learning how to use those to build or enhance a single chord properly. So in this video, we're going to take a step back, go back to basics, analyze every single interval you can have in the 12-tone scale, how to think about intervals in general, and how to incorporate them into your music. Let's do it. Starting with the absolute worst of the bunch, the half step. Now, you may have had some bad experiences in the past, but I see no reason why you can't settle your differences here and now. There are a couple spots where you might use this, and a couple where you should probably never use it, unless you're doing some kind of postmodern stuff, which, by the way, if someone critiques your song and says that some of your chords sound like shit in an otherwise pristine EDM track, and you cite a postmodern influence, or the classic "there's no rules in music, bruh" as an explanation, that's a shitty defense. You know who you are. So in a major chord, by far the most common place to add this is between the root and the 7th below it. And you'll notice as you start adding these notes that the overall sound of the chord changes quite a bit, whereas if you have a simple triad, aka a 3-note chord, the inversions don't really change the sound that much. Another spot where you might dump one of these is between the 6th and the 7th, which gives you some creative jazz voicings. And lastly, you can slide one of these between the 3rd and the 4th, with the caveat that this tends to sound better on something like a guitar sound, rather than something like a piano sample. Guitars overall tend to do better with close distribution of notes because of their particular overtone makeup and their plucked nature. Now, this by no means covers all possibilities, but it's up to you to experiment and figure out different sounds and what works for the type of music that you're making. Some situations where you definitely don't want to use this, unless, again, you're playing some kind of postmodern EDM bullshit, is between the 6th and the sharp 5th, the 4th and the flat 5th, the 7th and the sharp 6th, and the 3rd and the sharp 2nd. For the minor 3rd, you can add it between the 2nd and the 3rd, the 5th and the 6th, the natural 6th and the 7th, and the natural 7th and the root. You can also try adding the sharp 4th next to the 5th. This will give you a very dark, twisted, tormented sound, and depending on the type of music that you're making, that might be exactly what you're looking for. This video is going to be a lot longer than I thought. Sorry about that. Next up, the whole step. This one's way more lenient, as you can pretty much use it anywhere you want without fear of being considered an irredeemable musical failure. Now you'll notice there's a lot of overlap here. If you add the 2nd degree of the scale to a minor chord, for instance, you create both a whole step and a half step in terms of intervals. Use that to determine whether we want to change the notes around some to avoid certain dissonances. Now with major and minor thirds, you might think that there's not a lot of places where you can add them, say for stacking them on top of one another. That is until you stop thinking conventionally and start adding them on top of other added intervals like seconds. And that's really the point of this, to stop thinking so much about scale degrees and sharp 9s and add 5s and sus chords and dominant 7s, and start thinking more about groups of intervals and how they relate to one another in the context of a harmonic progression. Fourths are a special animal because you can pretty much build your entire harmonic philosophy on those intervals, much like the jazz pianists of old, like Duke Ellington, Art Tatum, Bill Evans. They work great as sus chords, modified 7th chords, minor 6 or 13 chords, stuff like that. And keep in mind that a C minor chord with an added 2nd or a C minor with a perfect 4th built on top of it, those both technically have 4ths in them, except the former is buried in the middle of the chord, while the latter just doubles the tonic, so it sounds exactly like a triad. Try to build these in such a way that they don't repeat the notes that you're already playing. Now the augmented 4th, also known as the diminished 5th, also known as the tritone, will generally generate some kind of dominant 7th chord or augmented chord, maybe some funky flat 9 chord. By itself, it sounds really weird, like you just drank half a bottle of whiskey and the walls are starting to shift around you and you're pretty sure you're about to die. Fun times. And the context of the chord or progression might take some of that away, but for the most part, you have to roll with that feeling. You have to realize that adding that interval will generally result in some kind of dense, alt-rock or jazzy sound. Perfect fifths sound very pristine and they're very fun to use. Part of why they sound so, well, perfect is because they're the first interval in the harmonic series apart from the octave, which sounds exactly like the tonic, more or less, so we don't count that. And so you perceive it the strongest. And the fourth sounds just as perfect because A, it's the next interval in the overtone series, and B, it's the inversion of the perfect fifth, so they were related all along. Ugh. As for how to use them, just building a circle of fifths by stacking these suckers on top of one another can be a fun exercise. One of my personal favorites is very sparse 9 chords, i.e. build 2 fifths on top of the root note. That's it. This works wonders for power chords and just low register material in general. The resonance it creates is just beautiful. Just remember, perfect fifths means stability, which is why pop music tends to love them and why jazz music tends to actively avoid them, because fuck stability. And here you just have to use some common sense, like for instance, don't build a perfect fifth on a C minor chord, let's say, maybe on the altered 6th degree of the scale, in this case A, because that will lead to some nasty shit. If you know that the top note of your chord will be a major third in relation to the root, whereas on the bottom you have a minor third in relation to the root, not cool. One of the things that this guy taught me is major 7th good, minor 9th bad. And what he meant by that is that pretty much all jazz harmonies require some kind of dissonance in order to function, and in that context, major 7ths are much more palatable, let's say, than minor 9ths, and the above example kind of illustrates that. This is of course not a rule but a guideline. There are obviously situations where a minor 9th is cool, but they're not as numerous as the major 7th situations. We'll get to those soon enough though. For now, let's focus on minor and major 6ths, and the reason I'm lumping those two together is because harmonically they function much like minor and major 3rds, since they're the inversions of them, and they kind of have the same effect regardless of whether you use a 3rd or a 6th. Now you can try to build a chord on 6th, but what you'll find is that what changes is mostly the distribution of the notes, not so much the overall sound of the chord. There's plenty of reasons why you might want a sparser sound, be it because it fits the genre, or simply you're going so low on the keyboard that you're starting to sound like Beethoven. And we finally arrived to the king and queen of the usable dissonance, the major and minor 7ths. These guys are the backbone of jazz harmony. If you hear a chord and no 7th is being formed between any two of its elements, chances are it won't sound all that jazzy or dissonant. I say that these are the lords of usable dissonance because, as we agreed earlier, the half step has a few niche applications and the whole step doesn't sound all that dissonant in most cases. But these are the inverted cousins, with almost an octave in between the two notes, so possibilities abound. More so than any other interval, this one has most to do with context. The example I always give on my stream, which by the way is linked below, follow me if you want to hang out there, is playing a major 7th on the keyboard without any context whatsoever and letting people note just how horrible that sounds, and then playing it in the context of a major 7th chord, and suddenly it sounds beautiful. So with the minor 7th, the most obvious use is as the 7 in the 7th chord, but don't stop there. You can also add a minor 7 on top of a major 7, which sounds more complicated than it is. One of my favorite uses is to just build a minor 7th on top of another minor 7th, which, depending on the rest of your voicing, yields this very cool sharp 5 dominant chord. With our Lord and Savior the major 7th, you can obviously build basic major and minor 7th chords, although the latter has very particular uses. And on the minor version, you can also expand the voicing by adding a 9th on top. Oh, would you look at that? 2 major 7ths in the same chord. That's where it gets fun for me, finding voicings that contain not 1 but 2 major 7ths and making them work together. Another example of that is the 11 chord, which has the 2nd major 7th occurring between the 5th and the 11th. No, I'm not giving you street directions. Pay attention. The easiest way to make 13 chords, by the way, is to think of a dominant chord, let's say G7, and then build a major 7th on top of the minor 7th that you already have. So in this case, the minor 7th interval we have is GF, and we build a major 7th from our F, so that's FE in this case. Same thing starting on C. C7 or C minor 7 works too, yields a minor 7th interval between C and B, so we build a major 7th interval on top of B flat, So that's B flat, A. And then just fill in the blanks between those two however we wish. Now one of my favorite uses of this interval is the major minor chord.
Nani?
Now you can call this a sharp 9 chord or voicing or whatever you want, but there's no escaping the fact that you're playing a major third and you're also playing a minor third on top of that one from the same root note. On paper this sounds like utter lunacy, but in practice it's one of the jazziest chords ever invented, and it doesn't really sound as dissonant when used as a dominant seventh. Although, yeah, in other cases, it can sound pretty messed up. And that's it. Not going over ninths or anything like that because it gets slightly redundant and we'd be here till the morning. Let me know if there's anything you'd like me to cover on this channel. Like, share, subscribe, click the bell, all that fun stuff. And remember, it's not the size that counts, it's how fast you move. Your fingers on the keyboard, I mean, not your dick.